My name is Umesh Wagmare. On behalf of the Indian Academy of Sciences, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the panel discussion here on academic freedom and institutional autonomy. With a strong commitment to diversity, free and creative thinking, an academic institution is expected to educate citizens through creation and dissemination of knowledge that would impact society and also help in achieving a more safe, just, and the fair state of our world. Central to this is the academic freedom, which is necessarily supported by the institutional autonomy, defined by UNESCO as a degree of self-governance necessary for effective decision-making by institutes of higher education regarding their academic work standards, management, and related activities. Previous Indian commissions of higher education, starting with the one headed by S. Radhakrishnan in 1948-49, the Kothari Commission in 1964 and 66, and then the one headed by Yashpal in 2009, all emphasized the need for autonomy in all institutions of higher education. The new National Education Policy of 2020 also recognizes the importance of academic freedom and autonomy. However, the institutional autonomy and academic freedom in India have been evolving dynamically. Recently, since 2014, there has been a sharp drop in India's position in terms of academic freedom index developed by the VDEM Institute of the University of Gothenburg, Sweden. A similar drop was observed during the emergency period 1975-27. In addition to freedom of academic and research within a campus, this index includes freedom of exchange and dissemination and of cultural expression. While greater autonomy is desirable ideally, its practical implementation needs to be maintain an acceptable level of accountability within the socio-economic framework available locally. Another element which seems to be relevant these days in India to institutional autonomy is the national security, which seems to be a new parameter in this thinking. Autonomy is a multi-scale concept that applies to institutions, departments, administration, heads of the institutions, leaders, faculty members, staff, and also the students. This panel discussion is expected to touch various aspects of academic freedom and institutional autonomy, particularly in the context of diverse set of universities and academic institutions in India, and hopefully stimulate ideas and development of optimal methods to achieve combination of greater autonomy and accountability. With us today, we have four panelists. We have Professor Sandeep Sancheti, who is the Vice Chancellor of Marwadi University in Rajkot. He earlier was a Vice Chancellor of SRM University, Chennai, and he represents private universities in India which are growing rather well of late. He also has authored scholarly articles on the topic of this panel discussion. With us, we have Professor Supriya Chaudhary, who represents Arts and Humanities and also a state public university. Professor Chaudhary is a well-known Indian scholar of English literature, and is a professor emerita at Jadavpur University and has written articles on academic freedom at various fora. We have Professor Annapurni Subramaniam, who is the director of Indian Institute of Astrophysics, Bangalore. She represents an autonomous institution of the Department of Science and Technology of Government of India, who has been experiencing the changes in autonomy firsthand, and we will hear from her the recent experience as well as her own idea. Finally, the idea for this panel discussion was seeded by Professor M.S. Raghunathan, a well-known mathematician. He has long experience in various types of academic institutions at various levels, and he is presently at the Center for Excellence in Basic Sciences of Mumbai, which belongs to Department of Atomic Energy, the Mumbai University.
Good evening, Dr. Umesh Wagmareji, all other distinguished panelists, Professor Chaudhary, Professor Subramaniam, Professor Raghunathan, other participants and attendees. Very happy to join you today to talk on a topic or a subject which is very dear to me, which is very close to me. I'm saying that because when I became a lecturer in 1984, I enjoyed that autonomy that I was a self-drawing and dispersing officer in a government job when I was just a lecturer. So I understand the dimensions of that to a certain extent. As has been introduced, I think autonomy is more about the self-governance or your own control. To an extent, it can be akin to what we call freedom of speech. We have never understood, time and again, media or others, all of us learned people keep discussing what is beyond the limit in freedom of speech and what is not, what is cutting, going below the line or what is above the line kind of a thing. I think autonomy to some extent falls in the same category. Autonomy is also like a dream. I can say, if I give some crude meaning to it, I can also say it is a mirage. I can also say that on the lighter side, let people not take it otherwise, and that is that you wake up a vice chancellor in the middle of the night and say there is someone who is going to help you, and some Aladdin ka chirag or something like that, and the person is ready to fulfill your wish. The vice chancellor is most likely to ask for more autonomy for his institution or functioning. I think that is the kind of dream it has. So there are challenges, there are good things about autonomy. I'm going to share some of my views. Number one, I would say that autonomy is something inversely related to regulation. The more the regulation, the lesser the autonomy is, and it is directly related to accountability or responsibility. Now, how to balance all these parameters, what is directly and inversely related, would be pretty difficult. Also, I would say that the moment you take this as a model of relationship and you try to implement it in a smaller set of things, where maybe in an institution only 500,000 students are there, probably scalability may not be an issue, and you can very well allow the autonomy to percolate to the right levels and make it functional. But the moment I've headed India's biggest private institution, which singular, not an affiliated mode, which had 55,000 students, and imagine how to run an autonomy in that. So scalability is something very, very big as a challenge. But on the other side, if you give autonomy, the systems become more scalable also. So it's something like in a vicious circle, you keep functioning for autonomy and you keep driving the scalability. And then scalability also brings you the more challenges in terms of what we call autonomy. Autonomy was experimented by the UGC in various forms, but I would say that it did not become successful to a larger extent. The model still continues and still is there, but I think the number of institutions, colleges which are given autonomy hasn't crossed 1,000 in my opinion. Maybe if the recent numbers have changed, pardon me for that. Maybe because it was overly regulated kind of a setup and people did not probably easily digested what change was given to them. They were still going to their AKAs and still seeking their permission. Can we do it? I find it in my university, my system. I give power to many people. They keep coming back to me, sir, we are doing this. Can you approve this? And I say, no, I don't have to approve this. You better own the responsibility and go ahead with that. So that is a change of mindset which we have to bring, sometimes which is difficult. I would say that UGC was an example, which was an approving agency, which was a rule-making agency, which was a funding agency, which was also assessing agency in terms of quality and others, and which was also an agency which will penalize me or anyone if I'm doing wrong. And that's where the autonomy never got implemented in true sense. Later, RUSA and other experiments happened, and therefore some sort of autonomy was given to the state or participating institutions, but still it wasn't enough. In any case, I would say that autonomy can be a very complex term. If I define some parameters now, one autonomy will be administrative, which can also be called as an organizational. The second autonomy, I can call it as a managerial. One can use a word operational for that also. The next autonomy, the most important for most of us, is the academic autonomy, may be related to research also. And then the fourth autonomy, which I'll possibly say would be the financial autonomy. I'll just quickly say administrative autonomy, organizational things are not very easy because everything is defined by the acts and statutes, the government institutions. And so is the case with the private ones, but the private ones have the flexibility. The managerial and operational issues in government are very, very complicated because of RTI and procedures and non-clarity of other things, whereas in private, they are much better. But when it comes to academic autonomy, the government ones score over the private ones because they have a bigger handle and they are liberally assessed in case of something goes wrong. And academic autonomy is the one we should crave for, which enjoy as a head of the academic institution. I should strive to give that empowerment to my deans. They should give it to my HODs. They should give it to my faculty, and further in turn, it should be given to the students. And by the way, NEP 2020 is highly, positive on what we call student centricity or education 4.0. And student centricity is nothing but the autonomy to the student. Whether he would like to be taught by Sandeep Sancheti or not will be the call of the student and not the call of Sandeep Sancheti or the institution. I think that is a kind of change so if we can implement research and academic autonomy fully, I think we'll be highly successful. Managerial and administrative will be very difficult. However, I'll come to the next one, the fourth autonomy called financial autonomy. Now, this again is the real mirage. It cannot happen easily. If I give some money to my son regularly, I'll probably tend to ask, where has he used this particular money? If the government gives you public money to an institution, they are bound to ask where this money has been used. And therefore, in financial terms, you can never be free unless you charge adequately, unless you have created corpuses and endowments, which some of the big institutions of the world have done. And now IIMs are doing it. They have started charging significantly, and I'm sure they are financially autonomous. They are not. So unless you have enough money in your kitty, you cannot be financially autonomous. And if you are dependent for money on other sources, generally speaking, your autonomy will get compromised, whatever you may be, however powerful or visionary you may be. The one who gives money is bound to ask you a question and you have to answer or satisfy their questions to you. So I can say that it is one of the most demanded aspect or element from the academic world. And I would like to say that academic autonomy or autonomy in general cannot be given. Most of my colleagues, I've been AIU president, Association of Indian University president, and we had lots of discussion on these subjects. And I find most of my colleagues, senior colleagues will crave and cry that government is not giving us autonomy. If government has to come and give you the autonomy, then you will always be dependent. And once you are dependent, you cannot be autonomous for sure. I used to tell them that autonomy can never be given. Autonomy has to be taken. You have to take the plunge and you have to say, this is what I'm going to do because the rules permit me to do so. And there are provisions for me to do certain things like that. So what I would say that all of us should try to gain autonomy by capturing it, by assessing it, by imagining it, and by functionalizing it, rather than depending on others that government will come and serve you the autonomy on a platter. This will never happen. This can be strengthened only if it trickles down to the lowest level. If I enjoy 90% of autonomy in my functioning, I think my dean should get 75%, my HOD should get 60%, and a student should also get something. Most of us think that I am head of the institution, I am autonomous, I will do everything which is required for the institution, and others will only simply follow me because I am autonomous. I think that's again a wrong notion which is there. And one study from AIU, which we did some years back, and we had presented it to the parliamentary committees a couple of times, that autonomy has led to better successes of educational institutions if they were given right from the beginning or early stages. Examples are IIT, they are a very stable academic setup. Examples are IIMs, which are there, partly NLUs and other things also. But see the NIT system to which I belong. I've headed 7 NITs in my life. And I know that they were tossed like no one's child, once in Karnataka University, once in Mangalore, once in Bangalore, once in VTU, once independent, once autonomous deemed university. So with that, what happened is we were not stable at all. So once you are given autonomy, institutions yielded better performance or results that is a study scientifically done through data, which is also available. People who are seeking autonomy should probably, I'll take one more minute, Professor Wagmare. I know your time limitations and I'll try to close because I've put my timer also. Those who are seeking autonomy probably should know that it is more work. When I started my career, we were not so autonomous academically. Someone will make syllabus, someone will make question paper, someone else will assess the copy, someone else will declare the result, and then someone else will give them the degrees. Today, I have to do everything on my own. Autonomy will also mean more work for me. And if we are aspiring for autonomy, we should make sure that we don't get into rudimentary things which generally government or anyone will expect. I want to become autonomous primarily because I want to be more efficient. I want to have more speed in my decision making, and I want to drive quality. I know that what is to be done and not to be done. That cannot be done in a non-autonomous mode easily. I repeat again, if I'm seeking efficiency, speed, and quality, probably I should be given more autonomy is what I would possibly say. And my final word on this is this autonomy and quality and approvals and regulations, they are a vicious circle. Where and how you will break it, I think you will have to figure it out based on your operating conditions and your system's needs which are there. But also remember that there is nothing called absolute autonomy in this world, and we should not aspire for that. So these are my words. I'll be ready for more questions later. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Sancheti. We now welcome Professor Supriya Chaudhary to make her remark.
Thank you very much. My thanks to Professor Wagmare and the Indian Academy of Sciences for inviting me to speak today. And thanks also to my co-panelists, especially Professor Sancheti, for his very focused and relevant remarks, which make my task also much easier. Since I'm the only representative of the humanities here, I will try to place the social sciences and humanities within the larger higher education landscape, with reference particularly to India's national education policy, that's the NEP 2020. Now, as we look at this document, we may be struck by a governing anomaly. The NEP 2020 as a document is divided between the urge to centralize and control, and at the same time to recognize the heterogeneity and variety that there is in the Indian education landscape on the ground. It mentions institutional autonomy and academic freedom, but at the same time, it envisions a complete overhaul and transformation of India's higher education system. By 2040, it proposes a move to large multidisciplinary institutions, each having thousands of students, teaching and researching in a range of subjects across humanities, sciences, technical, vocational streams, and encouraging their combination in the interests of what is called holistic learning. Now, the structure of degrees and credits is also to be broken up. And I can give you the citations, but obviously we all know this document very well. Now, clearly, the autonomy and academic freedom of existing specialized or largely single stream institutions like the IITs, IIMs, the IASc will be directly impacted by such state policy. And the humanities, social sciences, and applied arts will gain more purchase and visibility. So you have a projected diverse landscape, but at the same time, it is centrally mandated. Now, here's a question. Should we take the argument about autonomy to the level of national policy directives that affect institutional identities? After all, you could say that these identities are not sacrosanct. They also originated in the compulsions of national educational policy in the post-independence era. So if you think of the IITs and so on, their genesis lies in national educational policy directives also in this particular time of nation building. So freedom and autonomy, as Professor Sancheti also pointed out, are not static, unchanging concepts, especially in such a vast, unequal country where aspirations and identities are invested in higher education. At the same time, we notice that NEP constantly uses the terms autonomy and freedom. What promise then do these terms actually hold out? First, let's look at this one by one. First, the NEP picks up and echoes the UGC's earlier directive published in February 2018 on graded autonomy for different categories of HEIs, higher education institutes. Colleges, for example, are to become large, multidisciplinary, self-governing, degree-granting institutions, framing their own courses, exercising administrative, academic, and financial autonomy. Professor Sancheti has already pointed out the loopholes in this general blanket application of the term autonomy to highly complex systems. You can't really do that. But the NEP also promises academic freedom in a different way. It attaches academic freedom to course flexibility, opportunities for cross-disciplinary discussion and debate, and the exposure of students and researchers to a wide variety of knowledge fields, enabling creative combinations of disciplines for study. This I quote from the NEP. Now, you could say there's nothing wrong with this vision of autonomous degree-granting public and private HEIs, promoting academic free thinking and flexibility by cross-disciplinary training. But why then are there publicly expressed concerns about academic freedom and institutional autonomy, which Professor Vadmari referred to right at the start? Why are these concerns frequently voiced by representatives of the humanities and social sciences? A paradox, given that NEP's holistic education actually gives more prominence to the humanities and social sciences. And here we may refer, for example, to Nandini Sundar and Gauhar Fazli's status report on academic freedom in India, which was written in direct response to that event which Professor Vadmari mentioned, that India had slid down many notches in the Global Academic Freedom Index published by the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And many others have joined this debate. My own contribution to the India Higher Education Report mentions this, and so too other public debates. So at this point, we need to return to policy, not as a set of directives, but as Professor Sancheti also pointed out, as forms of control. What actually is institutional autonomy? Who exercises this autonomy? The institution is made up of a number of stakeholders, including students, faculty, other staff, funders, prepayers, taxpayers, and so on. What relations exist between these different interest groups? Are they democratic? Are they hierarchical? Is a dictatorial system in place? Who is to exercise this autonomy that is being talked about? Financial control, and I will not go into this because Professor Sancheti said a lot about this, is extremely important in both private and publicly managed institutions. And think of two thorny problems enmeshed in legal and political regulations. One, affirmative action in respect of both students and faculty, that is to say, implementing quotas for hiring and also student admission. And secondly, internationalization of campuses, which would involve admitting foreign students and hiring foreign faculty. How much is to be allowed? Who is to allow it? Where is the autonomy to go ahead on one's own terms? Who is to decide? This is a very important and problematic issue. Now, on the other hand, academic freedom has two aspects. Freedom of expression guaranteed as a constitutional right, and freedom of inquiry, of research and knowledge expansion as an academic ideal within the university space. Now, humanities and social science scholars tend to run foul both of university authorities and of the government when they try to exercise what might be called an academic freedom as a citizen. That is to say, they often come up against a number of controls and regulations or even laws in the public space, and then they are subject to censorship in the sense of certain civil service conduct rules sometimes being applied to them or being sought to be applied to them, or even charges of sedition in the public sphere. And so penal action could be of various kinds in the public sphere. But there is a more important and, for our purposes, much more relevant area, which is the university itself. Here, the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of research, of certain kinds of course framing and curriculum design, all of these obviously require a certain measure of academic freedom. That is to say, within the university space itself, freedom consists in the freedom to pursue knowledge on one's own terms. And here, among the many regulatory bodies proposed by the NEP 2020 is a National Research Foundation that is to vet and fund new research in addition to existing funding bodies like the DST, DAE, UGC, all of them are mentioned. In addition, we are also to have an NRF, the National Research Foundation, which will actively and competitively, it says, fund new research. Now, we know that research is driven by funding. Intellectual collaborations also are particularly subject to political barriers and regulations. Research visas tend to make foreign collaborators very difficult to, the difficulty in getting research visas for foreign collaborators is extreme. Recently, MHRD wanted to vet all foreign contributions to online conferences. This is a proposal that was shot down by the intervention of the scientists, and we are really, really grateful to the scientists for intervening in this important area. In a recent controversial case, the director of IIMA, Ahmedabad, refused to allow the HR ministry to formally review a PhD thesis that had been passed by his institute. And the various other threats too, particularly the humanities and social sciences, particularly because these are more, as it were, they are publicly more available and accessible to common understanding. In Gujarat last year, the government circulated a list of PhD research topics. We know about the banning of texts, history gets rewritten, pseudoscience tends to want to usurp scientific spaces. Now, I'll just close here by saying that the last book that he published in his lifetime, The Conflict of the Faculties, the philosopher Immanuel Kant suggested that the task of philosophy, and by philosophy he meant science, humanities, social sciences altogether in the university, was to pursue truth on its own terms and to find it and express it where it could be found. This was contrasted by him to what he called the rule-bound disciplines of theology, medicine, and law. Now, this distinction might no longer be useful, but it does bring us back to the central principle of academic freedom, and I do think that the final area where we need to value academic freedom and seek institutional autonomy is the pursuit of knowledge on the university campus. The other things, they are important. I myself am very exercised about them, but I don't think that as scholars, as educationists, we must not allow our attention to be deflected from the major thing, which is the campus itself and what we are doing there. This freedom of operation within the university space is then bound to bring about engagement with the public world of actions and consequences. And here it is decentralization and diversity rather than centralized control that can achieve true academic freedom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chaudhary. Very much. We now welcome Dr. Annapurni Subramaniam to make her remarks.
Hi everyone, and I must thank the Indian Academy of Sciences as well as Umesh for inviting me to share my thoughts in this particular panel discussion. And I represent one of the autonomous institutions under the Department of Science and Technology, and I head the Indian Institute of Astrophysics, Bangalore. So I think I'm thankful to the previous speakers for setting the stage extremely nicely. So I would like to put the core question as getting the right balance between autonomy and accountability. With each decision to increase institutional autonomy, governments also have to reassure the public that these institutions are held accountable. So the challenge is to determine how much accountability is optimum. Too much accountability can lead to stagnation of innovation, falling behind deadlines and expectations, and not able to catch up with international standards. And the lengthy and winding procedures put tremendous stress on institution building, setting up laboratories and facilities. Procedural red tapes often lead to slip in schedules and cost escalation in all of this above, and thereby defeating the main purpose of efficient spending. And this is one of the main deterrents for aspiring scientists to take up ambitious projects or leadership positions. So we look at, do I want to take up something big to do something? I will always be scared because I don't know what is in for, and I don't know what kind of roadblocks I will be able to, there are. So it is a big deterrent. It is important to fast track procedures and processes with light and tight framework. Lessons learned from the pandemic, where we had to scale up and do things much faster, as well as lessons we have learned from the international mega projects. There are many institutions participating in it. These should be folded in, and I would think one should be moving from state controlled to state supervised to self-supervised, where you have a one-step process for approvals, but it has to be tight. So that probably is the way I would think to go. This one, the academic freedom, the system of command and control does not promote accountability. On the other hand, it creates frustration and grudge in many cases. The government may exert pressure on the autonomy of the institutions in multiple ways, which we have heard from the previous speakers as well. Steering from a distance using authority is very common. It's important to reduce the feeling of external control in any institution, because this stops them from taking ownership and saying that anyway somebody is going to decide or somebody is going to change all the decisions I'm going to make. So why am I thinking seriously about it? So this has to be reduced, and this will help in amplifying the sense of ownership within. We need flexible framework to adapt to changing times, international and national scenarios and academic requirements, and these should be encouraged. This might require hiring or establishing facilities on short time scales. These kind of scenarios, we are not able to do anything, even if we want to, scale up things much faster to meet the requirements, immediate things like including pandemic, we have seen many cases. So there should be flexibility in the framework. And above all, sharing information and data are integral to academics. And this is absolutely necessary for the growth of the society, science, and the country. And we also have seen decline in hesitancy in sharing data, etc. So that is very important. And from my experience, I put down, this is the, do we find solution in NEP 2020? I think Professor Chaudhary has already addressed this. And there is a particular term which is mentioned there, which is actually quite ambitious, but it will only be as good as its implementation. So it's very important that if it is implemented properly, probably there's we can look forward to, but I'm not sure. The governance of higher educational institutions by highly qualified independent boards having academic and administrative autonomy, that's a very good move, and that if coming well, then it can actually provide a one-step approval and leading to self-supervision. From my experience so far, I think a couple of points were already alluded to. I think that to get the best out of the scientists as well as institutions, it is important to not to frustrate them, because many of the institutions can get quite frustrated based on this quite tightening of the system. The restrictions such as the international travel using only, or internal as well as international travel, both using only Air India. This is a stringent factor, and many times the things are not clear, and you get into whether to approve or not to approve. So this kind of problems arise. Recently introduced controls in international travel because there are some stipulated durations are there, and holding even remote meetings, as is already mentioned by Professor Chaudhary. These make us quite frustrated. In fact, I should also tell you that if you actually apply for approvals for holding an international meeting, the approvals actually arrive one day before the meeting. So what is the purpose? The approval is obtained so that you can get the speakers, get their visas or approvals in to streamline the process. It just doesn't happen. So if you have control, we should also have the solutions so that it moves seamlessly. That doesn't happen. New global tender guidelines. We have been facing issues with it. Because it is a part of the Atmanirbhar Bharat, absolutely fine. It's a brilliant idea. We need to have sustainability, etc. But in fact, there are many areas, many equipments which are not available in India, not manufactured here. It is very clear. It is very absolutely transparent that you can't get it there. But then to get the approvals and you start the thing rolling, it takes enormous amount of time. You lose time. You lose track of the focus of your science endeavor. So institutions dealing with fundamental science are now asked how much commercialization they can do. And that is another issue. They were asked how many papers they published until a few years ago. So you cannot just change the gear completely in a few years and say that you are thinking on some direction. You completely change your thinking on some other direction. That is not absolute. That's not desirable, right? And some of the above can be relaxed, which can help us focus more on research and science. One must seriously think before asking an institution to start doing something that is not suited for. All the effort put into build it up over the specific for a specific purpose over the years should not go wasted. It is also important to have a good communication from the state or central authorities to specify their perspectives. So in many cases, while introducing a new regulation or setting up something, they may have certain ideas or certain perspectives. It must be communicated. Otherwise, it could be received with, if they communicate well, it could be received with a better perspective instead of a bitter perspective. So, I mean, it should be explained well. The last point I want to point out is that finding ways to quickly mitigate the roadblocks in procedural matters is also an extremely important step for better functioning of the institutions. We see that many institutions get tangled up in various sort of procedures, and you do not know how to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and that frustrates. I think Umesh, you know what I'm talking about. So it frustrates a lot. So it must be there must be ways to certain higher ups or whatever someone can step in and say that hello, this is to be mitigated. This has to be solved. So. That is very important to be put in place, and that will really ease up certain functionalities and certain procedures within institutions. And I must, that's all from me. I just wanted to tell you that I did this particular document by Sandeep Sancheti. I really liked reading it. Thank you so much for it. And the rest of these are my references. Thank you.
I'm happy to have this opportunity to say a few words about institutional autonomy. Speakers before me have said many things. So, in fact, had I known what they're going to say, my talk would have been a little different. But that's too late for that, and I'll have to go ahead with what I've prepared. In any case, I'm going to confine myself largely to the question of autonomy and academic freedom in government-funded institutions, funded largely by the government. I'm not here going to talk about privately funded organizations, which also are often autonomous, but I'm not going to talk about that. My main concern is with the autonomy of institutions funded by the government. The concept of an autonomous institution supported by the government was not unfamiliar to ancient India. Such a concept is implicit in the patronage extended by some rulers, especially to religious organizations. However, it was deliberately formulated only by the British colonial administration. The universities set up by the British in India were the concrete realizations of the concept. It would be fair to consider the concept of autonomy, of autonomous institutions, to be a legacy of the colonial administration, one of the welcome legacies. The post-independence period, the number of such autonomous institutions has grown exponentially. Most of them, if not all, are devoted to scientific, cultural, academic, and educational pursuits, their objectives being promotion of excellence in these areas. In a broad sense, they are structured similarly, even while there may be wide variations in the finer details. The university form a big chunk of these, but there are a good number of other institutions called grant and aid institutions. And I must say that my experience is more with grant and aid institutions than with universities. So many of the comments I make will very much apply to grant and aid institutions, though I suppose they also apply to universities at large. Autonomy of these institutions means that they have their own well-formulated objectives and function under their own rules and bylaws. The terms of employment and the conduct rules of their structure can be and are different from those of government servants. The most striking difference is perhaps the absence in the bylaws of most of these institutions, a clause in the service rules of the government servants, which prohibits any criticism of government actions or policies in a public forum. This is probably one thing in which all the rules and bylaws differ from the government rules for their government employees. Each institution has its own administrative structure. In broad outline, structures of different institutions do not vary a great deal. There is an administrative head in whom practically all power is vested, and there are one or two bodies that oversee different aspects of the administration. In the case of aided institutions, there is one governing body called the Governing Council. In the case of universities, there can be more than one. The main function of these bodies is to ensure that the institution functions within the ambit of its own bylaws. One of these bodies is empowered to change the rules and bylaws or policy. They are not involved in the day-to-day functioning of the institution, though. The governing bodies usually have representatives of the government on them, but their role in principle is limited to ensuring that the institute functions in accordance with its own bylaws and in keeping with its own objectives. And of course, since the government is funding it, they also have to ensure that the funds are used correctly. Even when they are involved in changing bylaws or policies, they are constrained to act as part of a larger group, and they do not have any veto power over these things. In some cases, there's a formal head about the administrative head of the institution, but this is understood to be a largely ceremonial arrangement. In the Nehruvian era, notwithstanding all the formal provisions, it is evident that the autonomy of an institution can be a reality only with the goodwill of the government. During the years when Jawaharlal Nehru University was the Prime Minister, there was an abundance of this goodwill. There was rarely a serious interference by the government in the functioning of autonomous institutions, especially in crucial areas like the appointment of the head. It must also be said that the credentials of many of these heads those days were impeccable. There is an undeniable connection between institutional autonomy and excellence. The art performs best when he or she has total freedom to choose what to work on, which autonomy guarantees. Empirical evidence of this connection is to be seen in the great degree of autonomy enjoyed by great institutions like the University of Cambridge. State interference was responsible for the decline of German science under the Nazis, and we know the harm Lysenko did to Soviet biology. Autonomy in practice, as I said, is dependent on the goodwill of the government. Unfortunately, after Nehru, this goodwill has been getting scarcer and scarcer. In consequence, there has been a steady erosion of the autonomy. Increasingly, the government tries to force autonomous institutions to take punitive action against their members who criticize government policy or action publicly, even though the bylaws of the institution do not provide for such action. And some institutions have unfortunately yielded to the pressure. There have been protests against this kind of infringement on the autonomy, but mostly by academics in the humanities, and sadly, not so much by scientists. This is perhaps because critical appraisals of the government can be an integral part of the line of work in humanities, while the scientist does not see in prohibition of criticism of the government an obstacle to his pursuit, to his or her pursuit. But this is short-sighted. The clout with the government enjoyed by the likes of Baba Ramdev should make us wary. A somewhat indirect way in which the government can and does curb autonomy is to ensure by clandestine means that heads of these institutions are ardent supporters of its policies. In any case, are amenable to pressure. This way, while on paper there is no violation of autonomy, de facto the government controls its institution. And of course, since they fund the institution, that's an excellent handle for them to do this. This seems to have gone on systematically over the last few years. a good number of government's active sympathizers are now heading these institutions. I must hasten to add that such a charge against earlier governments cannot be dismissed summarily, but the present government has shown much greater proclivity for this kind of assault on autonomy. But there actually has been a direct assault on autonomy way back, some 20 years back. The rule brought in 2001 or 2002 requires that all appointments at senior levels at grant and aid institutions be cleared by the Appointments Committee of the Cabinet. Obviously, a direct reference in the appointment of heads of these institutions. Unfortunately, the institutions seem to have accepted this without protest. Every institution is a governing body which is empowered to change rules and bylaws. And as I said, there are members on this body who represent the government. They are, however, not expected to play a proactive role. But the governments over the last 50 years and more often ignored such expectations and got these aid institutions to amend or change bylaws in the manner it wants. It must be said that some of these institutions have been willing to crawl when asked to bend. In a recent move, the Department of Energy, for instance, decided that the governing bodies of all its aided institutions will be chaired by the Secretary of the Department. This was not the case earlier. It has implemented the decision in all its institutions except one, which is chaired by a lead industrialist. Surely this is a move towards curtailing the autonomy of these institutions, a step that will make the functioning of the institution more uniform, paying little attention to their individual character or needs. In these efforts to making institutions change their character, funding provides great leverage, and successive governments have had no compunctions in using it. There are many institutions run directly by the government departments whose employees are government servants. The CSIR laboratories and BRC are examples of these. They do not enjoy the kind of autonomy that the institutes do, but their very existence creates a certain amount of pressure for curtailing the autonomy of the grant and aid institutions. It's a general perception, and unfortunately correct one, that over the last several decades, many of our autonomous institutions have declined. One of the principal causes for this decline, in my opinion, is the considerable erosion of autonomy over the years. Calcutta University's great days are the pre-independence years, when it was led by the visionary Ashutosh Mukherjee, who brooked no inroads into its autonomy. In recent years, the government's efforts at clipping the autonomy have been brazen. Government's interference apart, there are many other factors. The quality of the leadership, for one, that has led to a certain uniformity in these autonomous institutions, in the way these autonomous institutions function. For example, promotion norms of the faculty are practically identical in all of them. Some can no longer respond to exceptional performance with the alacrity with which they could in another era. Uniformity tends to move institutions towards standards of the weak ones among them rather than the strong ones. So far, I've talked about autonomy of institutions vis-a-vis the government, but internal autonomy in this institution is also a serious issue. In most cases, formally at least, there seems to be very little internal autonomy. It seems to me that the heads are invested with practically all the power, and there is often not even a formal mechanism for consultation, even with senior colleagues. There is a strong case for diffusion of power to subunits of the institution. I will content myself here with drawing your attention to this issue. My personal experience is limited to some granted institutions of the Department of Atomic Energy, but I suspect that if anything, other institutions have not fared any better on this issue of autonomy. Let me end this talk with an appeal to the Academy. I'm indeed happy that the Academy has organized this panel discussion on this important issue. This is just the first step. We need to reverse this process of erosion of autonomy, and I appeal to the Academy to explore possible ways of doing this.
Thank you very much, Professor Raghunathan. I must say that the four panelists have covered really interesting complementary domains of this very important subject of academic freedom and autonomy, although there were, of course, linkages between different views and talks that we heard today. So now the floor is open for the participants here to come in and make their remarks, ask questions, or make comments.
Can I say something about the comment Dr. T.R. Raju has put up?
Yes, please. Yeah.
Okay. While I appreciate what Dr. Raju has put, he is very categorically making a mention, never ever top-down approach should be practiced in an academic institution. The answer I'm giving you is not necessarily for an academic institution. One size fits all will never be the right approach. leader with an experience obviously has certain value. And I was a young leader at the age of 45 when I started heading institution. I learned a lot from my top brasses. But it was all on the basis of the value. And therefore, I would say that let's not isolate anyone in the process, whether you are from the top or you are from the bottom. I understand a lot of consultation. I think Professor Raghunathan also said consultative processes of stakeholders are important. So a lot of bottom up and a lot of top down, both should merge somewhere in decision making. A lot of openness in approaches should be there. Everything should not be penned down and kind of casted in iron or a stone that it cannot be changed. If that is the case, autonomy cannot be there. And therefore, no stakeholder, whether he or she is from top or bottom, cannot be removed from what you call decision making. Yes, one clear answer to what Dr. Raju has said, Professor Raju has said, is already there in NEP, that the student should be the king or the lowest in the ladder of an academic institution because he is recipient. An ABC scheme has come, Academic Bank of Credit. Fortunately, I had worked on that scheme for last 2.5 years on behalf of UGC, and therefore I can very well say this scheme makes students autonomous, irrespective of what a vice chancellor would like to do or what a UGC or any other agency would like to do. Once this scheme is implemented, the world will be of a student, which disciplines, which language, what speed, which institution, which teacher, which timetable, and which type of degree. And if you don't decide on a type of degree or nature of degree, you can still get a multidisciplinary degree called education. So there's lots of freedom already as far as that question is concerned.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Sancheti. Yes, Ram, would you like to say something first? Ram Ramaswamy.
Oh, yeah. All right. I think actually, on the matter of what is autonomy and what are the issues of autonomy in our institutions, all the panelists have really done a very fine job in covering everything. What I would like to say that one of the most important reasons why we need autonomy and why this lack of autonomy is really hurting our educational institutions is the very simple fact of, the huge diversity in our country, not just in terms of, the states and whatever the languages, the usual incredible India kind of stuff that one hears, but more importantly, institutions in different parts of our country get very different resources, whether it is money, whether it is power, whether it is geographical location, and so on. And therefore, having a uniform set of rules and regulations as envisaged by our successive education policies, most recently the 2021, those can actually be very, very difficult to implement. What works well in New Delhi does not work well in Koraput, and or in Tiruvarur or in Nagaland. I understand that this academic bank of credits, etc., works, how it's supposed to work. In practice, it cannot work at all because our students, the bulk of the students that we need to educate, do not have the kind of mobility that we are talking about. So I really feel that we should couple autonomy, academic autonomy, with sort of take it very seriously, because the diversity of our institutions needs our vice chancellors, administrators, teachers, and our students to determine for themselves what needs to be done. One can go on about this, but I really think that this is an appeal to our general consciousness to go to the autonomy that we need, because we are a very diverse country. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram, very much. Ram is our past president of the academy. I now request Partha Majumdar to speak up.
Yeah, thank you, Umesh. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. It was really a pleasure listening to all the four panelists. One of the points that many of the panelists have made is that there has been erosion in academic freedom and institutional autonomy. Oftentimes, we hear that our predecessors have misused or overused the kind of freedom that they have had in terms that they enjoyed at the time when they were building institutions or administering institutions. And as a result of that, public money was spent with a less amount of responsibility. This is what we oftentimes hear. And this is why there is greater and greater control by the government over autonomous institutions and academic freedom. I just want to hear from and Professor Raghunathan also mentioned dates when these may have happened, the kind of major landmark events leading to erosion of autonomy. I would like to hear from the panelists what they feel about this one major cause that is oftentimes touted as the root cause of curbing of individual freedom, academic freedom, and institutional autonomy. What do they think about it?
Right. Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to respond to Professor Ramaswamy and also to Professor Partha Majumdar, because in a way the questions are related. I completely agree with Professor Ramaswamy that we need to take special cognizance of the diversity of the country and the fact that different needs are present in the very, very complex and diversified higher education landscape, that it cannot be a single set of centrally mandated systems that are put in place and that they will fit everybody. In fact, my whole life has been spent in public institutions, in two state-funded institutions, Presidency College and Jadavpur University, with a brief period teaching also in Calcutta University. All of these are state-funded, not centrally funded institutions. And we were obviously bound by the act that, under which we were founded. But I think that we did feel that our actions, whatever we were teaching, however we were treating our students, were of direct benefit to society. And this was a very important feeling that kept us going, even in the middle of often very adverse circumstances. And, I think that Annapurni talked about, the various red tape and all kinds of permissions and things that you require. I have spent ages and ages doing this kind of thing, getting permissions from the UGC, writing letters, responding to responses to for accounts and so on. But I do feel that sense that we are trying to do something for students who are, who have different diverse needs and are in a publicly funded institutions studying through taxpayers' money. This is a very important consideration, and the government needs to pay much more attention than it is doing to publicly funded institutions. Secondly, within the higher education landscape, I also emphasize diversity. I do think that it is for a young student a good thing to be studying in an undergraduate college and then going on to IASc for a higher degree. It's almost like going abroad. It's as important to that student as getting a scholarship to go to Cambridge or something, that the person gets a scholarship and is able to go to IASc. It is a very important way of as it were, accommodating different needs at different levels. And I think that needs to be preserved and valued for what it is. IISc cannot become another Calcutta University. I don't think it should. Why should it? So anyway, that's one thing. And Professor Majumdar, I think somebody else was wanting to respond to Professor Majumdar. I've said enough. I will stop here. Thank you.
Professor Annapurni Subramaniam, will you respond to Professor Majumdar, please?
Yeah. So that's a very important point, Professor Majumdar. What I remember in this particular topic, when there was a meeting in the DST's, I think, Golden Jubilee celebration, when people were talking, the previous secretary was talking. So Dr. Ramamurthy made this particular comment, which is very valid. in our system, we have failed to differentiate between R&D failure and fraud. Because even you set up an institution, when you set up facilities, there are greater risks involved, and people have taken, and they are given the liberty to set up something at very hard circumstances, and many have succeeded, and that is the reason why our science is at this stage. That has to be given credit. But certain experiments, certain times do fail. But that is not because of a fraud, that is because of a clear R&D failure. And if you look at it carefully, the lessons learned from the failure would have been much more than the success attained by another project. So one has to look into this particular aspect, and the system has to recognize what is an R&D failure and what is the fraud. That is very important.
Thank you, Professor Subramaniam. Does any of the other panelists want to come in at this stage?
Yes, please.
Professor Raghunathan. Yes.
Yeah, I just want to respond to what Professor Majumdar said. He said the withdrawal of autonomy is supposed to be because some institution did not perform well, and that this is performed correctly. This is absurd. What need to be changed is the leadership of that institution. If not to stop the autonomy, that is a ridiculous way of handling the situation. If somebody fails in his leadership quality, just replace him by a suitable person. That would be the solution. Curtailing the autonomy is not the solution for that. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I request Professor Sancheti to come in, I will read out one question which he may be able to address as well. The question is asked by Dr. Yadav. Can more transparency and standardization lower the barriers between private and government institutions? Professor Sancheti, over to you, please.
I think this is a slightly different question, lowering of barrier between government and private. Rules are not necessarily distinctive as far as government and private are concerned. The way it is applied or interpreted are different. Internationalization is required, this is to be taught, and this is the qualification of the faculty. Everything remains to be the same, the physical parameters, everything. But the way it is applied, it is different. Once you go to a government institution, you find deficiencies, you say, hey, nothing wrong, it's fine, it's a government institution. But in a private one, sometimes it's taken to task. I think our own attitude, people assessing, implementing it probably make the difference. Government is not necessarily making difference. I would say for whatever is lacking in the autonomy today, we ourselves as academics are responsible. We cut each other's route. Some of the examples which were given possibly are primarily because of we are not in unison. We are not united. We don't know what we need to do. I would like to also comment on what was said by Professor Ramasamy, and that is the non-linearities of operation. We know this term very well because many of us come from the scientific background. Non-linearities of operation will always yield challenges. Autonomy is not a standard set of conditions. Every set of conditions will be new, and therefore let's accept that there will be some failures, as was being said by Professor Subramaniam, that the failure should be part of the success, and we should record failure, feel proud of that, and I'm sure no one can challenge it. I must also say that the leadership which comes to implement what we call autonomy is generally not trained to do so. Let me make a comment about some of the top leaders called vice chancellors. Most of them are selected on the primary criteria of how many PhDs guided and how many papers published and how many years of experience. But they don't see their skills of handling difficult situations or different attributes of leadership which are required in difficult times. And therefore, that is the reason why many heads of institutions in the country suddenly get knocked off once they come into that position. Maybe they're trying to emulate a model where the political leadership, how the political leadership behaves. Academic world is a very different. They cannot be just so-called very autocratic in nature. Academic world gives you a lot of liberty provided you take the team along, whereas something in the political domain is different. So we need to give more training to the leaders, and I'm sure autonomy will succeed. Boards are being given more autonomy in NEP 2020. We all know that. And for example, the boards of IIMs are selecting the the new board chairmen and the new board members. I'm also a member of IASc's board right now. And in the last 3 years, I would say I have not faced a single situation where we were compelled to take a decision or where we're required to take a decision which was forced from outside. We took whatever is to be taken from within. And therefore, I will say that people in the seat would matter what autonomy means to us rather than everything given. One last comment, which was by Professor Majumdar. He said that no ABC will fail. I don't know anything or everything can fail in India or succeed. It all depends. But we have worked very hard to put it together. His comment was that students are not mobile in India and therefore it will fail. Let me tell you, sir, this is precisely because of this nature the scheme has been put that students become mobile. We are giving them power. Let me tell you, we have done the assessment. Best of the best students will use at the top 10% to begin with to take advantage of all the features of advanced courses, high-speed learning, doing it in lesser time, lesser cost. And similarly, the most bottommost who cannot sustain the studies or intensity of studies, instead of doing it in 3 or 4 years, they'll do it in 5 or 6 years, and they will also take advantage because the liberty is given, and they will come out with their degrees without failing any time. So when the system is designed to handle the extreme cases easily, the system is bound to be successful. I think it's change of mindset which is required in all of us. Till now, I don't think so we have given any liberty to any of our students in general in education, but today we'll have to give, otherwise we will be creating a suicide for our institutions, and therefore autonomy will be the key driver for our educational setup in the country and maybe for research, as was being said by Professor Chaudhary and also Madam Subramaniam. So thank you so much.
I have a question, sir. What are the positive and negative side of autonomy?
My quick answer to you, Professor Mishra, positive is you can do a lot of things creatively, dynamically, speed, efficiency, diversity, everything can come. The negative side is you can be very autocratic and you can damage the system, you can play with the system, and sometimes those damages can be little irrevocable. It is something like that. If I have a gun in hand and I'm playing with it in a crowd, the chances are that I can shoot myself and I can shoot many others also. So power always corrupts. Power would be given under autonomy to the people who are supposed to have the power, but they should handle it carefully. All the good and bad probably coexist, right and wrong coexist, head and tail coexist, and so is the signal and noise. So please remember that autonomy, if not used properly, can be damaging also. That's my take.
Thank you, Professor Sancheti. Does any of the other panelists want to say anything quickly in the last minute?
Yeah, I remember Professor Balram in one of his talks said that autonomy and anarchy, they're very close by, so you can easily slip from one to the other. So one has to be very careful. So it stays with me.